Look at how much you've grown. Bring it in. Happy hot harmony summer, everyone. Over the next few videos, I'm going to do a quick mini series where I look at harmony and a few of my favorite goosebumps causing metal riffs. Here is the first one. Protest the Hero is one of those by musicians, for musicians, music. It's 100% music bands that I've always admired. But this prog metal, Spirit, Stallion of the Cimarron, Lin-Manuel Miranda core concept album about the Wild West, written by Canadians, has no right to be as good as it is. Palimpsest wedged its way into my brain and body last summer and hasn't really left since, especially because of sections like this from Gardenias, which feel somehow both fragile and overwhelmingly powerful at the same time. Like so much of this album, it's right on the border of being goofy, but the riff is so creative and professionally delivered that it crosses over into the fun sublime, a rare but really vital thing in metal. The riff section has two guitar parts. The bass part, which is doubled on guitar later, uses this fast 7/16 pattern grouped as 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 1, and then with a turnaround measure that's grouped as 2 plus 5, or I really maybe feel this as 3 plus 4. So it's ta 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 ta, etc. Here's that slow. As it gets faster, though, it gets a lot harder to hear the individual subdivisions, and it starts to sound like this just slightly off-kilter, bouncy thing. The other guitar part does this super tricky accent thing on just the last and first subdivisions of each of these 7/16 cycles, which sounds even wonkier because there's less to grab onto. Makes it especially hard when it gets faster because you don't have it's really hard to subdivide and hear, boom, ba-doom, 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 ba-boom, ba-doom, 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 ba-da-boom, ba-doom, even though it's I'll just play it. How about that? This meticulously off-center, lurching forward feeling is also created by the harmony, which I am treating as the main character of this video. It's maybe kind of a corrective after spending so much time on rhythm and meter for my dissertation. The guitar parts both outline clear triads, one per 7/16 cycle, and there are 16 total cycles, so 16 total chords before the whole thing loops. And it's all pretty clearly tonal, so that's the basic framework we're working with. So I'm going to refer to these 16 different chords, each as a hyperbeat. So, we've talked about hypermeasure a little bit before, just kind of a nice shorthand. So hyperbeat 1 is first chord, hyperbeat 2 is the second chord, and it's a hyperbeat because each of these beats is actually a full measure of 7/16, but we're kind of zooming out. So we have 4 measures of 4 hyperbeats, even though each measure is in 7/16, if that makes sense. And if it doesn't make sense, figure it out. I think it'll become clear as I use these examples. It's just a way of saying where we are in the progression. The first quarter of this chord progression, so the first 4 chords, goes from B flat major to E flat minor to D flat major
to C flat major to A diminished.
So it sounds pretty clearly like 5 going to 1 to flat 7 to 5 of 5 to go back to where we started. Already this is kind of fun because it starts en media res with the 5 chord instead of the much more common thing of starting on the 1 and then going to the 5 before coming back. So starting on the 5, again, gives some forward momentum right off the bat, and then there's also a short functional chain at the end that leads back to the B flat chord. So the 5 of 5 going back to 5. The next quarter of the riff starts on B flat, goes to E flat minor again, but then jumps straight down to G flat major, then up to B flat major again. This maybe destabilized the sense of tonic a little bit. Until now, there was no reason not to hear E flat minor as the tonic, but the G flat major sounds kind of satisfying here, probably because it's in the lower register, and maybe also because unless you're hearing this for the very first time, you might kind of have an idea of where this is going. There's also another cool destabilization happening here. The B flat chord has been happening on hyperbeat 1 out of 4, so on the first chord and on the 5th chord. Now it's shifted over. It's early, so it's on hyperbeat 4 out of the it's the first, 5th, and 8th chord out of the 16 overall. So it feels like it's kind of jumping in early again, or even earlier than it was from starting on it at the beginning. So that B flat major chord, that 5 of E flat is shifted earlier in time, and then we get E flat minor on hyperbeat 1, so on the 9th chord, the exact halfway point of this whole progression. And we go from that E flat minor to G flat major. The chords here start to kind of liquefy, and what really gets drawn out in the next few chords is this descending chromatic line from F to D as we go from B flat minor to B flat diminished 7th to C flat major to C flat minor. And then we wrap the whole thing up by landing squarely on G flat, which definitely feels like the tonic now. And then we put everything in motion again with an A flat 7 chord on the last hyperbeat of the whole thing, which takes us back towards the B flat major chord to start again. So functionally, this is kind of like a 5 of 4 going to 4, and then minor 4, 1, and then landing on 1 structure with G flat as the tonic, which is not the most common way to return to a 1 chord, but it's also not unheard of. There are a handful of songs that use this progression. I mean, there are actually kind of a lot, but I'll show you a handful. The difference with these pop examples, though, is that in those, the chord loop ends with the distinctive 4 to minor 4 thing, and then resolves by returning to 1 at the start of the next time through the chord progression. The directed motion in Gardenias is a little different because it's not just the progression restarting that brings us back to 1. It actually feels like the 4 to minor 4 thing leads directly to the 1 chord because the 1 chord happens at this, still within the course of the whole progression. It's not just looping back to the beginning. It sounds like it's taking the place of a cadence of a 5 chord. In some sense, this doesn't feel much like a resolution. And I think that's kind of a cool feeling because it feels a little bit like the bottom suddenly just drops out of the progression and we fall back to 1 kind of suddenly. This falling feeling is heightened by the fact that we drop in root position to near the bottom of the low open string. The warm, homey sound of the 1 chord is made sweeter for being a little bit unexpected if we hear it like this. But I realized as I was listening that this is tapping into another harmonic pattern that's very familiar, even if this isn't exactly the same as that harmonic pattern. This familiar pattern or schema, I can use that word. It's, schema is just like a kind of prototype pattern that we've heard in a lot of different versions, and we're used to, if we hear the beginning of it, we expect to hear the end of it. And these can be, formal schemas, when you hear the verse, you think it's going to go to the chorus, or they can be more specific, like voice leading things, like I'm going to talk about here, where you hear one type of chord and you think it's going to go to the next one. So this familiar schema that I'm talking about here, that the 4 to minor 4 to 1 part of the progression is similar to, is a drumroll cadential 6/4 chord, which is a 5 chord with a suspension that then resolves to a regular 5 chord and then goes back to 1. This is familiar, at least to me, who's listened to a lot of classical music. It's a very strong way of signaling closure in a lot of Baroque and classical music. There are at least 2 big differences between a cadential 6/4 and the 4 to minor 4 motion acting as a quasi-cadential thing. For one, it's not a 5 chord, right? A 4 chord is not a 5 chord. The root motion back to 1 is different. And then the other thing is that the descending half step motion is from the major third to the minor third above the root instead of a fourth to a major third. So it's not acting as a suspension, it's acting as a change of quality of chord. These things would make a huge difference in the apparatus of classical music theory that identifies a cadential 6/4 as a structurally important thing. But I think that when we're hearing and playing these things outside of that tradition, it's easy to let our ear be drawn to the pattern of descending half step followed by emphatic resolution, which is the same for both patterns, both the cadential 6/4 schema and this kind of tricky fake version of it in the 4 minor 4 1 pattern. That's kind of cool. I think that's another way of thinking about how this resolves back to 1. It's like this kind of off-center way of resolving. There's one more chord in this progression before the whole section gets looped, and it's yet another opportunity for this type of uncanny valley sidestepping kind of feeling that we've had. The last chord of the progression is an A flat 7 chord, which is in tonal harmony would typically be a 5 of 5 chord resolving like this. Or instead, we could get a 5 of 5 of 6 chord, which is where the progression actually goes, and that would sound like this. But instead, it's treated like a passing chord, which moves by step back up to B flat to restart the progression. It's like the functional meaning is kind of hijacked and we take this unexpected side route instead of the main path. It's also similar to the 4 to minor 4 thing because we hear a dominant chord at the end of the progression and hear that it's going back to the start of the progression. And that's kind of close enough to the schema of how dominant 7th chords normally work that we're like, okay, it makes sense, even if the strictly tonal syntax is kind of broken. So to summarize, there's a lot of things contributing to the off-center, like hurtling through space feel of this section. And altogether, it makes for one of these sections that feels so perfectly off balance and also like white hot intense that it leaves my timbers completely shivered. And one more thing. Harmony is cool, and it is hot harmony summer, but I think texture is maybe the subtle hero of this section. The riff section has a few versions of more or less the same thing. First with just the bass, then with palm muted guitar accents when the voice comes in, then with the clean guitar doubling the bass line, then with everything distorted and unmuted. The good old-fashioned soft start and terraced buildup is the perfect framing for this gem of a riff. And yeah, I mean the vocals are just like really cool too. That melodic line, the lyrics are definitely also contributing to how I'm interpreting all these kind of off-center things in the rhythm and the harmony. Such a good riff. 45 feet from here to there, 45 feet through the air. See ya.